Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Judith Ruderman. When I moved to the forest 4 years ago, I purged a lot of papers, and I'm sure you did too. But one thing I did not purge was my folder on Ann Tyler. I'm a huge Ann Tyler fan. From her very first novel, 1964, If Morning Ever Comes, all the way through every single novel until her latest, 2022, French Braid. Now, Ann Tyler is over 80, but she is still very prolific. I'm going to read to you from 2 essays that she wrote about her writing process and about her life, but they're from when she was a younger writer. The first is from 1976, and it was published in the Washington Post. And it was at a time when she was writing Earthly Possessions. I show you this for a reason. The second one, I'm going to read you excerpts from Still Just Writing, published in 1981 in a collection of essays by women writers, and it was the year after she had published Morgan's Passing, to which she refers in that essay. So first, Confessions of a Novelist. Mostly it's lies writing novels. You set out to tell an untrue story and you try to make it believable, even to yourself, which calls for details. Any good lie does. I'm quicker to believe I was once a circus aerialist if I remember that just before every performance, I used to dip my hands in a box of chalk powder that smelled like clean, dry cloth being torn. Maybe, in fact, I once was a circus aerialist. One lie leads to another. The tangled web you weave gives birth to events on its own. But that's if things are going well. I can tell they're going well when the words start running ahead of themselves. If I set aside my work for a cup of coffee, the characters continue talking in my mind, or I keep hearing my own rather sexless, neutral narrator's voice spinning away at the story. What comes once. I have to either resign myself to losing it or forego my cup of coffee. I choose in favor of the coffee more often than I used to, though. It's begun to dawn on me that ideas are infinite in number and more will always show up. I used to be afraid we had a limited lifetime supply. But I'm talking about the easy part, the middle, when I know where I'm headed. The hard part is the beginning. I have to begin all over every day. I get up at 6 or 6:30 to clean the house and feed the children and cook our supper ahead of time so that I can be perfectly free the instant the children leave for school. But then when they're gone, I find I'd rather do almost anything than go into my study. The door is so tall and dark it looms. The whole room smells like a carpenter's shop because of the wooden bookcases. Ordinarily, it's a pleasant smell, but mornings it makes me feel sick. I have to walk in as if by accident, with my mind on something else. Otherwise, I'd never make it. I write sitting cross-legged on a very hard couch. I use a retractable ballpoint pen for which I keep a constant store of 24 refills, fine-tipped black, in case the Parker Company suddenly goes out of business and leaves me helpless. These are the little rituals that make novelists look neurotic. I don't type because then I wouldn't hear my characters' voices, and besides, I often have the feeling that everything flows direct from my right hand. What if I got arthritis? It's my second greatest fear, next to going blind because it matters very much how the words look on the page. Also, there is only one room I can work in, a stern white cubicle. Most of the pictures on its walls, I realized one day, have to do with isolation, uninhabited houses, deserted courtrooms, stark old men staring into space. I hate to travel away from here. I hate even to rearrange the furniture or start writing at an unaccustomed time. All these magic spells to get me going. And still, I spend the first half hour of every morning just clicking the point of my pen in and out. What's the purpose of this, I think then? And it occurs to me that I'm really doing no more now than I did at age 3, telling myself stories in order to get to sleep at night. Except now I tell stories in the daytime as well. They've taken over my life. It's probably very unhealthy. But then my thoughts will snag on something, some passerby I remember from years ago, or some intricate family situation I've often idly wondered about. I haven't, since my teens, used an actual living person in any of my writing, but a number of characters have been born out of thoughts I've had while watching an actual person. What would it be like to be that woman, to be the daughter of that man? And then what would happen if... I write because I want more than one life. I insist on a wider selection. It's greed, plain and simple. When my characters join the circus, I'm joining the circus. Although I am happily married, I spend a great deal of time mentally living with incompatible husbands. Once your mind is caught on the right snag, there's nothing so hard about the mechanics of writing. Though it's tedious walking your characters from the dining room to the living room. And don't forget, you've given one a tray of pastries, so she'd have a little trouble shaking hands. What's hard is that there are times when your character simply won't obey you. Nearly every writer I've heard of says that. Not one has satisfactorily explained it. Where did those little paper people get so much power? I'll have in mind an event for them. A departure, a wedding, a happy ending. I write steadily toward that event, but when I reach it, everything stops. I can't go on. Sentences come out stilted. Dialogue doesn't sound real. Every new attempt ends up in the wastebasket. I try again from another angle and then another until I'm forced to admit it. The characters just won't allow this. I'll have to let the plot go their way. And when I do, everything falls into place. No wonder I often feel, sitting alone in my study, that the room is overpopulated. And sometimes I imagine retiring to a peaceful little town where everyone I've invented is living in houses on Main Street. There are worse retirement plans. After all, they're people I've loved, or I never would have bothered writing about them. I work until the children come home, 3:30 or 4 in the afternoon. If things are going well, I feel a little drugged by the events in my story. I'm desperate to know what happens next. When the children ring the doorbell, I have trouble sorting my lives out. The children complain regularly that I'm not really paying attention when I let them in, and they're right. I save my afternoons for them and feel lucky to have such indisputable, ultra-real ties to the everyday world. But still, in those first few minutes, I'm torn in two directions, and I often wonder what it would be like to live alone in a shack by the sea and work 23 hours a day. We bake cookies, run the dog, argue a lot. My characters grow paler and paler and finally slink away. In the evenings, occasionally, between baths and bed and other sorts of chaos, a sudden idea will flash into my mind, a person or a plot or a snatch of dialogue. I write it down on an index card and take it to my study. The carpenter smell overwhelms me. In the dark, I see those feverish pages scattered across the couch. I set the card beside them and wipe my hands on my apron. I feel I've made an offering to someone, another person entirely. I sleep well at night, but I believe some sort of automatic pilot works then to solve problems in my plots. I go to bed trustful that they'll be taken care of by morning, and towards dawn I often wake up and notice, as if from a distance, that my mind is still churning out stories without any help from me at all. Sometimes I think I'd rather do something else. I lean toward manual labor mainly. I'd like to run a repair shop for toys. I'd like to start an herb farm. And it wouldn't be so bad working for one of those companies that takes on odd jobs for old ladies, driving them to their palmists, collecting their ground rents for them. But I see I'm reverting. I'm wondering how it feels to be a palmist. A whole long kite-tail of thoughts flutters in. What would I do if I had nowhere to put my thoughts? I wish I weren't a writer every time the writing's over. The bad part comes when you have to deal with galley proofs, publicity, biographical sketches. I am protected, I'm positively cushioned, by a very understanding agent, but still, I'm forced to see what I've overlooked until now. These daydreams I've been weaving are no longer my private property. Good Lord, other people are going to read them. It's hard enough just having to end the book, to send all my characters alone to New York City. I picture my favorite hero, a shy, pudgy man, waiting hopefully by the railroad tracks with his clumsy little suitcase. For weeks before I finish a novel, I swear I'm going to celebrate the minute I've mailed it off. Throw a party, take to strong drink. But when I come back from the post office, the house seems so quiet, and I can't believe how white and bleak my study is. You lose some things, too. You start off with one book in January and end up with another in December. Nothing ever turns out the way you imagined it would. You lose stories that trail away and die just after the second paragraph, and others that look wonderful on Friday afternoon and terrible on Monday morning. And gradually you lose the feeling that you might someday be another Tolstoy. I am 34 years old now and see that I have a ceiling. There are limits to what I should attempt. At 22, I didn't know that yet. You lose friends who can't understand why you never seem to recognize them in the supermarket. Supermarkets are good places for letting your mind wander. And other friends who call during work hours and feel you're not holding up your end of the conversation. And still others who say, since you're just sitting home all day, could you please watch my children from 8 till 4? It seems to be a job where the actual doing matters more than the results. Certainly the results are pretty puny. One narrow book after all that time, and on the very first page I find something I'd like to cross out. It's so distant now, the whole business. I'm already working on something else, but I suspect that the something else is often a form of protection. Caught up in a brand new story, I'm able to feel more detached about both good and bad reviews. In fact, I tend to read reviews as if they refer to a whole different person. Or sometimes I read them to see if they can tell me what I was writing about. But I've never seen a review that answered that, and I admit it's expecting too much. It would be nice to be rich, but anyhow, money makes me anxious. And I used to think I'd like to be famous, but that was based on a misapprehension. I pictured fame as my entering into other people's lives, not they're entering mine. Besides, I've never been able to autograph a book without feeling like an imposter. Then why don't I just put what I write in a drawer somewhere and forget about having it published? Because sometimes people send letters saying they sat up all night with my book and forgot to feed the cats. These letters are rare. I don't mean to imply that they arrive every day or even every year. Then I see that they in their solitude and I in mine have somehow managed to touch without either of us feeling intruded upon. We spend some time on neutral territory, sharing a life that belongs to neither of us. That I do care about. I've only been able to write this by pretending it's untrue. I pretend I'm a woman who writes books. I lead a happy, peaceful existence, inhabiting the same dense web of stories that surrounded me when I was 3. Sometimes I even get paid for it, which seems stranger than a lot of things I've invented. I'm still waiting to see what I'll be when I grow up. That's Ann Tyler at 34, and this book, Earthly Possessions, is very typical of her. The paring down, the getting rid of things, the leaving, it's all Ann. And by the way, if you're big fans of Ann Tyler, you recognize that little pudgy man on the station going to New York City. That's the hero, I forget his name, from Celestial Navigation. These are excerpts from Still Just Writing. And the first paragraph refers to this novel, Morgan's Passing. While I was painting the downstairs hall, I thought of a novel to write. Really, I just thought of a character. He more or less wandered into my mind wearing a beard and a broad-brimmed leather hat. I figured that if I sat down and organized this character on paper, a novel would grow up around him. But it was March, and the children's spring vacation began the next day. So I waited. After spring vacation, the children went back to school, but the dog got worms. It was a little complicated at the vet's, and I lost a day. By then it was Thursday. Friday is the only day I can buy the groceries, pick up the new cedar chips for the gerbils, scrub the bathrooms. I waited till Monday. Still, that left me 4 good weeks in April to block out the novel. By May, I was ready to start actually writing, but I had to do it in patches. There was the follow-up treatment at the vet, and then a half-day spent trailing the dog with a specimen tin so the lab could be sure the treatment had really worked. There were visits from the washing machine repairman and the Davy Tree Man, not to mention briefer interruptions by the meter reader, 5 Jehovah's Witnesses, and 2 Mormons. People telephoned wanting to sell me permanent light bulbs and waterproof basements. An Iranian cousin of my husband's had a baby, then the cousin's uncle died, then the cousin's mother decided to go home to Iran and needed to know where to buy a black American coat before she left. There are no black American coats. Don't Americans wear mourning? I told her no, but I checked around at all the department stores anyway because she didn't speak English. Then I wrote chapters 1 and 2. I had planned to work till 3:30 every day, but it was a month of early quittings. Once for the children's dental appointment, one for the cat's rabies shot, one for our older daughter's orthopedist, and twice for her gymnastic meets. Sitting on the bleachers in the school gymnasium, I told myself I could always use this in a novel someplace. But I couldn't really picture writing a novel about 20 little girls in leotards trying to walk the length of a wooden beam without falling off. By the time I'd written chapter 3, it was Memorial Day, and the children were home again. I'm skipping. She goes through, as you can imagine, month after month of diversions. Before we had children, I worked in a library. It was a boring job, but I tend to like doing boring things. I would sit on a stool alphabetizing Russian catalog cards and listening to the other librarians talking around me. It made me think of my adolescence, which was spent listening to the tobacco stringers while I handed tobacco. At night, I'd go home from the library and write. I never wrote what the librarians said exactly, but having those voices in my ears all day helped me summon up my own characters' voices. Then our first baby came along, an insomniac. I quit work and stayed home all day with her and walked her all night. Even if I had found the time to write, I wouldn't have had the insides. I felt drained. Too much care and feeling were being drawn out of me, and the only voices I heard now were by appointment. People who came to dinner or invited us to dinner and who therefore felt they had to make deliberate conversation. That's one thing writers never have, and I still miss it, the easygoing, on and off again, gossipy murmurs of people working alongside each other all day. Skipping. After the children started school, I put up the partitions in my mind. I would rush around in the morning, braiding their hair, packing their lunches. Then the second they were gone, I would grow quiet and climb the stairs to my study. Sometimes a child would come home early, and I would feel a little tug between the two parts of me. I'd be absent-minded and short-tempered. Then gradually I learned to make the transition more easily. It feels like a sort of string that I tell myself to loosen. When the children come home, I drop the string and close the study door, and that's the end of it. It doesn't always work perfectly, of course. There are times when it doesn't work at all. If a child is sick, for instance, I can't possibly drop the children's end of the string, and I've learned not to try. It's easier just to stop writing for a while. Or if they're home but otherwise occupied, I no longer attempt to sneak off to my study to finish that one last page. I know that instantly, as if by magic, assorted little people will be pounding on my door requiring Band-Aids, tetanus shots, and a complete summation of the facts of life. Last spring, I bought a midget tape recorder to make notes on. I'd noticed that my best ideas came while I was running the vacuum cleaner, but I was always losing them. I thought this little recorder would help. I carried it around in my shirt pocket, but I was ignoring the partitions is what it was. I was letting one half of my life intrude upon the other. A child would be talking about her day at school, and suddenly I'd whip out the tape recorder and tell it, "Get Morgan out of that cocktail party. He's not the type to drink." "Huh?" the child would say. Both halves seemed ludicrous, unsynchronized. I took the recorder back to Radio Shack. Skipping. I was standing in the schoolyard waiting for a child when another mother came up to me. "Have you found work yet?" she asked. "Or are you still just writing?" Now, how am I supposed to answer that? I could take offense, come to think of it. Maybe the reason I didn't is that I halfway share her attitude. They're paying me for this? For just writing down untruthful stories? I'd better look around for more permanent employment. For I do consider writing to be a finite job. I expect that any day now I will have said all I have to say. I'll have used up all my characters, and then I'll be free to get on with my real life. When I make a note of new ideas on index cards, I imagine I'm clearing out my head, and that soon it will be empty and spacious. I file the cards in a little blue box, and I can picture myself using the final card one day. Through at last, and throwing the blue box away. I'm like a dentist who continually fights tooth decay, working toward the time when he's conquered it altogether and done himself out of a job. But my head keeps loading up again. The little blue box stays crowded and messy, even when I feel I have no ideas at all and can't possibly start the next chapter. I have a sense of something still bottled in me, trying to get out. People have always seemed funny and strange to me, and touching in unexpected ways. I can't shake off a sort of mist of irony that hangs over whatever I see. Probably that's what I'm trying to put across when I write. I may believe that I'm the one person who holds this view of things, and I'm always hurt when a reader says that I choose only bizarre or eccentric people to write about. It's not a matter of choice. It just seems to me that even the most ordinary person in real life will turn out to have something unusual at his center. I like to think that I might meet up with one of my past characters at the very next street corner. The odd thing is, sometimes I have. And if I were remotely religious, I'd believe that a little gathering of my characters would be waiting for me in heaven when I died. Then what happened, I'd ask them. How have things worked out since the last time I saw you? I think I was born with the impression that what happened in books was much more reasonable and interesting and real in some ways than what happened in life. I hated childhood and spent it sitting behind a book waiting for adulthood to arrive. When I ran out of books, I made up my own. At night, when I couldn't sleep, I made up stories in the dark. Most of my plots involved girls going west in covered wagons. I was truly furious that I'd been born too late to go west in a covered wagon. I know a poet who says that in order to be a writer, you have to have had rheumatic fever in your childhood. I've never had rheumatic fever, but I do believe that any kind of setting apart situation will do as well. In my case, it was emerging from that commune, really an experimental Quaker community in the wilderness, and trying to fit into the outside world. I was 11. I had never used a telephone and could strike a match on the soles of my bare feet. All the children in my new school looked very peculiar to me, and I certainly must have looked peculiar to them. I am still surprised to this day to find myself where I am. My life is so streamlined and full of modern conveniences. How did I get here? I have given up hope by now of ever losing my sense of distance. In fact, I seem to have come to cherish it. Neither I nor any of my brothers can stand being out among a crowd of people for any length of time at all. I spent my adolescence planning to be an artist, not a writer. After all, books had to be about major events, and none had ever happened to me. All I knew were tobacco workers, stringing the leaves I handed them and talking up a storm. Then I found a book of Eudora Welty's short stories in the high school library. She was writing about Edna Earle, who was so slow-witted that she could sit all day just pondering how the tail of the C got through the loop of the L on the Coca-Cola sign. Why, I knew Edna Earle. You mean you could write about such people? I've always meant to send Eudora Welty a thank you note, but I imagined she would find it a little strange. I wanted to go to Swarthmore College, but my parents suggested Duke instead, where I had a full scholarship, because my 3 brothers were coming along right behind me, and it was more important for boys to get a good education than for girls. That was the first and last time that my being female was ever a serious issue. I still don't think it was just, but I can't say it ruined my life. After all, Duke had Reynolds Price, who turned out to be the only person I ever knew who could actually teach writing. It all worked out in the end. I believe that for many writers, the hardest time is that dead spot after college, where their wonder children made much of, and before their first published work. Luckily, I didn't notice that part. I was so vague about what I wanted to do that I could hardly chafe at not yet doing it. I went to graduate school in Russian studies. I scrubbed decks on a boat in Maine. I got a job ordering books from the Soviet Union. Writing was something that crept in around the edges. For a while, I lived in New York, where I became addicted to riding any kind of train or subway. And while I wrote, I often felt I was nothing but an enormous eye, taking things in and turning them over and sorting them out. But who would I tell them to once I'd sorted them? I've never had more than 3 or 4 close friends at any period of my life. And anyway, I don't talk well. I'm the kind of person who wakes up at 4 in the morning and suddenly thinks of what she should have said yesterday at lunch. For me, writing something down was the only road out. You would think, since I waited so long and so hopefully for adulthood, that it would prove to be a disappointment. Actually, I figure it was worth the wait. I like everything about it but the paperwork, the income tax and protesting the Sears bill and renewing the AAA membership. I always did count on having a husband and children, and here they are. I'm surprised to find myself a writer, but have fitted it in fairly well, I think. The only real trouble that writing has ever brought me is an occasional sense of being invaded by the outside world. Why do people imagine that writers, having chosen the most private of professions, should be any good at performing in public, or should have the slightest desire to tell their secrets to interviewers from ladies' magazines? I feel I'm only holding myself together by being extremely firm and decisive about what I will do and what I will not do. I will write my books and raise the children. Anything else just fritters me away. I know this makes me seem narrow, but in fact, I am narrow. I like routine and rituals, and I hate leaving home. I have a sense of digging my heels in. I refuse to drive on freeways. I dread our annual vacation. Yet I'm continually prepared for travel. It is physically impossible for me to buy any necessity without buying a travel-sized version as well. I have a little toilet kit with soap and a nightgown forever packed and ready to go. How do you explain that? As the outside world grows less dependable, I keep buttressing my inside world, where people go on meaning well and surprising other people with little touches of grace. There are days when I sink into my novel like a pool and emerge feeling blank and bemused and used up. Then I drift over to the schoolyard, and there's this mother wondering if I'm doing anything halfway useful yet. Am I working? Have I found a job? No, I tell her. I'm still just writing.